Thanks to everyone for tuning in. Again, I am Michael Richardson, Senior State Network Manager here at NSC, and I have a very special guest with me, Katie Spiker, Managing Director of Government Affairs here at NSC. How are you doing today, Katie?
I'm good. Thanks for chatting with me, Michael.
No problem. Today, we wanted to talk a little bit about what is going on a federal level. There is a lot of movement taking place on a federal level, and it can be especially hard to pinpoint exactly what's happening in regard to workforce development. So we wanted to create some space to give an overview of the federal landscape and ways we can work together to advance an economic inclusive recovery. So let's just jump in. So Katie, can you talk to us a little bit about what Biden's administration's priorities have been that has had an impact on workforce development?
Absolutely. So there's been a lot of focus from this administration on workforce across the past year, since during both their transition and then once they've been in office. So first, folks are probably familiar with the two big proposals from the administration, the American Jobs Plan and the America's Family Plan, that sketch out and comprise the Build Back Better agenda from the Biden administration. The American Jobs Plan included proposals for $100 billion investments in workforce development. It focused on sector-based training programs with specific call-outs to clean energy, manufacturing, caregiving. It included a focus on partnerships between education providers, workforce boards, and industry partners, and on supporting workers who have lost their jobs, being able to access training necessary to get jobs in new industries or new occupations. The American Families Plan was a complement to the American Jobs Plan, and was intended to capture the proposals that the Biden administration was prioritizing that would help support people's access back into the workforce. So it included proposals for free community college, consistent with America's College Promise. It included access to universal pre-K, expanded childcare, as well as things like supporting students' access to basic needs and other supports to ensure that they can succeed in community college training programs. Outside of the White House and those two proposals, we've seen workforce development be a major priority for some of the bully pulpit and some of the work that's coming from education, the agencies of education, labor, commerce. They're working on interagency cooperation that help the three agencies work together on supporting workers' access to skills that meet industry demand right now. So last month, Andy, our CEO, interviewed Secretary of Labor Marty Walsh, who described the inflection point that the country is at right now and how critical investing that $100 billion proposed by the Biden administration is to our economic recovery. And then just yesterday, of course, folks heard from Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, in a conversation with Andy as well about that same priority. And these priorities have been, again, things that leaders of agencies are focused on, the White House is focused on, and we're starting to see movement from some of the activity within agencies in their jurisdiction too. So the Department of Commerce released a request for proposals to fund $500 million in grants to support partnerships between workforce stakeholders. The Department of Education has instructed financial aid administrators to use discretion to make it easier for unemployed students to access financial aid. And there really are priorities coming at all levels of the administration. But of course, this all turns on not just the administration proposing these investments or these policy changes, but in actually seeing what can pass Congress and how we can get the funding out to states and local areas to actually address worker need and business demand.
Thanks, Katie. So the administration has pushed these workforce priorities. Folks watching today will have seen our alerts, and your updates have focused a lot on what Congress is doing with those proposals and the bipartisan infrastructure package and the Build Back Better Act bill. How is Congress advancing or not advancing policies and investments that support workforce and inclusive economic recovery?
Yeah, well, your question kind of captured it, right? They're kind of doing both, advancing and not advancing at the same time. And as we're recording this, things are changing so frequently. Really, the answer to this is more speculation about where things could go than knowing exactly what's going to happen. But I think it's important to think about three pieces of legislation that Congress is working on now that are going to impact how workers are able to access skills training programs and how businesses are able to hire skilled workers. So first, there's the bipartisan infrastructure bill that really invests in roads and bridges. It also invests in digital access, including a big priority for many of the folks that are listening today and that we've been working on in helping people access digital skills necessary for jobs of the 21st century. The bill also invests in things for energy jobs, water. What it doesn't include, however, is the kind of comprehensive investment in workforce development that we saw proposed from the American Jobs Plan. It does include about $1 billion in more occupation-specific training programs, many of which are housed at Department of Energy or DOT. And so we're looking now towards the reconciliation process with the Build Back Better Act to pick up where the infrastructure bill fell short for workforce. The reconciliation process is a process that's being advanced by Democrats only on party line effort that really is an attempt by Democrats to advance the portions of the Build Back Better Act, the American Jobs Act, and America's Family Plan that were not included in that bipartisan infrastructure deal. So we've seen the House advance their components of this piece of legislation. The House Education and Labor Committee included $80 billion in workforce training. The House Ways and Means Committee included another $10 billion that would support some of the priorities that we saw from the American Jobs Plan. Those two committees' proposals included things like a $10 billion industry or sector partnership grant program, a re-up of investments in the TACT program, which supported partnerships between community colleges and industry and capacity at community colleges to deliver training that meet that industry demand. The House proposal also included investments in America's College Promise, or the free community college, that would enable students who are attending community colleges and participating in programs that are already eligible for grants or loans that are at least 300 clock hours to be able to essentially attend those programs without cost to the student. So given all of those pieces together, Build Back Better includes many of the priorities that the Build Back Better Act efforts in the House includes many of the priorities that we saw from the administration. But the House doesn't get to be the final decision maker on what actually gets passed, of course. So the real action for many of these proposals sits with the Senate. And what we're hearing is that the Senate numbers are drastically lower than the proposals we've seen out of the House. There's still time to influence these proposals. And I know that later we'll get to some of the ways that our network can do that. But I think it's important to recognize that while we saw an incredible win from the advocacy of our network and the impact and the outcome of what we saw proposed by the House Education and Labor and Ways and Means committees, it's likely to take significant advocacy to get to where a final number will come out from the Senate. So there's a third piece that's now moving through the House. So we have the bipartisan infrastructure package that included the Digital Equity Act and access to digital skills and some smaller training programs. Builds Back Better that included the free community college and significant proposals from the House, but still final decision waiting from the Senate on where those numbers are going to end up. And the third piece is the annual appropriations process that'll fund programs, for example, like continuation of funding for our workforce system through WIOA over the next year. And the longer that Congress goes without funding the normal function of the government, the harder and more contentious it gets in DC to pass something bipartisan like the infrastructure deal. And the more difficult it is for Democrats who are up in tough re-elections next year or more moderate districts to be able to defend the level of investment that's going to be really necessary in a reconciliation bill to meet workers' need and industry demand.
So let's talk a little bit about WIOA. We know WIOA is up for reauthorization. What do these supplemental investments in the public workforce system through Build Back Better Act mean for WIOA reauthorization, and where is Congress in that?
Yeah, so Congress has recognized over the past year that both one of the strategies to enable members of Congress to both understand the need for workforce investments and to justify significant workforce investments was to focus on how we can modernize the public workforce system to respond to the current time. And so both the Senate and House committees with jurisdiction over WIOA, the Senate Help Committee and the House Education and Labor Committee, worked through a bipartisan process together to solicit recommendations from stakeholders about what's really critical in WIOA reauthorization. The call for those recommendations went out earlier this spring, and over this summer, the committees worked with both Democrats and Republican staff and having conversations with stakeholders. And I think that bipartisan effort is really important at a time when Democrats are moving forward a partisan reconciliation process, and we see a lot of really partisan conversation happening both in DC and across the country. It's important to recognize that WIOA continues to be a key priority for both sides of the aisle. But some of that work has stalled just from the pure fact of capacity from staff on the Hill. A lot of the energy has obviously gone into thinking about the infrastructure deal, Build Back Better, annual appropriations. And so we're not expecting a massive WIOA reauthorization this year, but folks across our network will continue to hear from us as we launch some listening sessions and greater and deeper conversations with folks about what's the impact of the investment that we're seeing from Build Back Better, and how can we take lessons from any reconciliation package if we get to that. How can we take lessons from that investment to really inform how we can reauthorize and the kind of priorities for reauthorizing WIOA looking forward?
Thanks, Katie. And you've given a lot of great information, a lot to take in. Can you talk to us a little bit about what has, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, but what has NSC been doing to engage the network around these issues, and how can our network get involved?
Your question again hits on it right away, which is network is the reason, and the advocacy that folks that are listening today have been doing over the past year and a half is the reason that we've seen the kind of proposals from the Biden administration and from the House committees around the level of investment that's necessary. The amount of engagement from virtual Hill visits and virtual fly-ins that we've seen from folks, to sign-on letters. We just sent up a letter with more than 500 organizations signed on to it, and a separate letter with almost 150 industry associations and businesses to the Hill to call for investments at this level. Outreach to members from folks in our network to members of Congress has been consistent over the past year and a half. And it's really this advocacy that's making it possible for us to be even having conversations about workforce investment right now. And it should be obvious. It should be obvious to members of Congress that these kind of investments are critical. We want workers who lost their jobs to be able to access jobs created under an infrastructure bill or Builds Back Better. People need access to training, but we need to do continued advocacy over the next couple of months to make sure that these investments remain a key priority, not just for the administration, but for members of Congress who are actually going to pass the legislation that'll decide the amount of investment that states and local areas get. And that investment is going to continue over the next couple of months as we reach as Congress is able to hopefully pass infrastructure, Build Back Better, and appropriations bills, but it'll also continue past that to ensure that for reconciliation investments, for example, that agencies are implementing the funding passed through Congress in a way that advances racial equity, that responds to the needs of workers who don't have education past high school, and that addresses the demand that we see from small businesses across our country. So a couple really tangible things that folks can do. The resource page for this session includes a link to a sign-on letter. If you've already signed on to the sign-on letter, I hope that you'll circulate it to your network so that we can get the number of organizations signed on to that letter up, so that we can show even the breadth and depth of support for workforce investments and for meeting worker need and business demand. And then if folks aren't on our mailing list, be sure to pay attention to some of the upcoming advocacy opportunities that we'll have over the next couple of months as these decisions in Congress really come to a head.
All right, thanks, Katie. This has been a wealth of information, and I thank you for joining us today and helping us better understand what's happening on the federal level. Thank you all for tuning in.